Hey there, everyone. It's Mr. Albier, in case you're wondering who you're listening to. Um, it's it's a crazy night because I was sitting on my couch and I was thinking to myself, James, that's my name, James. James, you haven't been reading. Like, what's up with that? And honestly, I couldn't come up with an answer. I had no excuses. I just ha- haven't been reading, and so I decided to just get up off the couch and go and find the book that I normally read to all of the third grade students every year at this time of the school year. It's one of my favorite books. And actually, I have been reading it for 17 years now, 17 years approximately. In fact, I read it to Mr. Morton, and he kind of remembers it, but he remembers another book that I read because it's actually my favorite book. I don't want to tell you because I don't want you to read it before I read it to you. So, anyhow, this is another one of my favorite books, and I read it every year to each one of you. So, with that said, here it is. It's called Cabin on Trouble Creek. And if you are looking at the front cover here, you can see that it doesn't take place in modern day times. You can see that. You can see the boys here. There are two boys in this picture. In fact, they're brothers. Their names are Dan and Will. And you can kind of tell that they might live not in a modern setting. In fact, they're dressed in deer hides here, and they're obviously fishing with a spear, a handmade or homemade, if you will, spear. In fact, this book takes place in 1803, at a time when our country was actually growing. It was the time of in history when Thomas Jefferson was our president, and Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Lewis and Clark, you may have heard of these guys. Lewis and Clark set out on their journey to see if they could traverse across the land all the way to the Pacific Ocean from what was considered the United States at that point in time. The United States was everything from the Atlantic Ocean, the East Coast, all the way to the Mississippi River. So Lewis and Clark, during this time period, this is not Lewis and Clark, this is Dan and Will. Lewis and Clark, during this time period, were actually, they had a team of 50-something men plus them, and their dog named Seamus, I believe, or it was one of their dogs. And they traveled across what we now know as the United States to explore, to see what was there. And they were looking for a water route that would connect the East Coast with the West Coast where we live. They actually didn't find one. They were hoping they would find a river that stretched across the United States so they could just be in a boat the whole entire way. But they made it quite a ways, but then they ended up having to get out of the boat and then walk the rest of the way. Anyhow, that's part of history. This book, Cabin on Trouble Creek, takes place during that time period. So this is actually historical fiction made up. However, the book does tell you at the very end that, in the author's notes, that the story was roughly taken from a story about a real set of brothers, Daniel and Will, who were put into this situation. But the author doesn't really know what kind of events took place when the two boys were living during that time period. But they kind of just guessed, like, what would happen to two boys living in the woods during 1803. So, with that said, Cabin on Trouble Creek by Jean Van Leeuwen. Chapter 1. Daniel thought his eyes must be playing tricks on him. Those trees. Why, they must be the granddaddies of all the trees in the world. Thick around and tall, with vines growing up their sides as wide as tree trunks themselves, and crowded so tight together, they pretty near blocked out the sky. Never had he seen trees like this back in Pennsylvania. "Pa," he said, blinking. But his pa was too busy to pay him any mind. He had stopped the pack horse, Old Ben, and was looking around for something. Old Ben seemed grateful to rest after plodding along since first light. He bent his thin gray neck to browse the forest floor. Daniel's brother, Will, sat down to rest on a fallen log, and then jumped up again as Pa spoke. "It's here, boys!" he exclaimed. "The mark I made showing our land." Pa ran his hand over a faint slash in the bark of the biggest tree that Daniel had seen yet. This one was so broad around, he thought, it would take 5 men Pa's size to span its trunk. "Now," said Pa, "we need to find 3 more marks just like it." And he picketed Old Ben so he wouldn't wander. And then they began tramping through the woods, looking for the slashes that would show the boundaries of the land that Pa had picked out and paid for last spring. It was hard walking. Rain had fallen during the night, and the forest floor was soft and spongy under Daniel's feet. There was no trail. They had to climb over waist-high moss-covered logs and through dense, scratchy thickets. And though it was only mid-afternoon, the woods were dark with a strange green light. Somewhere up above the treetops was the sun, but its beams could not poke through the thick canopy of leaves. You could get lost in woods like these, Daniel thought. Each tree looked so much like the next one, and they stood so close together, like the long, thick, scarred legs of some giant beast. There was something unfriendly about these looming trees, unwelcoming. It was as if they were saying, "This is our land, and you have no place here." But what bothered Daniel even more was the quiet. Not a rustle, not a bird song, not a flash of squirrel leaping among the branches overhead. It seemed like nothing was alive here. Or maybe something was. Some wild creature stalking them, waiting to spring, like wolves or a bear, or even a panther. Pa said all of them lived in this vast woods that was now, in the year 1803, called the new state of Ohio. Probably not Indians, though. Most of the Delawares and the Shawnees and the Monsees had moved on to the north and west. What was that? Just behind Daniel, he had heard a small sound, like something creeping stealthily through the brush. He whirled around and his heart was thumping loudly in his chest, and he saw the waving gray tail of a squirrel disappearing around the side of a tree. Daniel let out a long breath of relief. At the same time, he felt a prick of shame for being afraid. He was 11 years old, after all. He looked over to see if his brother Will had been frightened, but his brother didn't appear to have noticed. Though Will was just 9, he never seemed scared of anything. He darted quickly through the trees, circling their trunks to look for the signs that Pa had left. And a moment later, he vanished from sight. "Stay close, boy," Pa warned in his deep, growling voice. He, too, must be thinking about the chance of getting lost. Well, it was Will who found the next slash mark. "Pa!" he shouted. "Look here!" Pa ran his hand over another long cut in the rough bark of an elm tree, and he nodded. "That's it." He sighted through the trees. "Should be a creek over thereabouts," he told him, "if I recollect right." They heard it before they saw it, a thin ripple of sound. Then the trees opened up a little, and Daniel made out the glint of running water. Moments later, the three of them stood on the bank of a wide stream, deep and slow moving, with bits of leaves and twigs drifting on top like tiny canoes on a river. Daniel and Will peered into the water for fish. Daniel couldn't see any, but he'd bet plenty were hiding in the dark water. "The man I bought the land from said they call this here creek Trouble Creek," Pa said. "Seems there was a massacre hereabouts a few years back." "A massacre?" Daniel swallowed hard. "A band of Indians ambushed a party of white soldiers up from Virginia, killed them all, started a big bunch of trouble." Looking into the water, Daniel suddenly saw a reddish color. Blood. But that was foolish. Whatever had happened here years ago had long since been washed away by the stream. "We've got nothing to fear, boys," Pa added quickly. "Things have been peaceful in these here parts close to 10 years now." Peaceful. That was how the creek looked to Daniel, with its gently flowing water and curling ferns, a pair of dragonflies hovering over its mossy bank. It was hard to imagine anything bad had ever happened here. Pa gazed down at the earth under his feet. "Why, just look at this soil, boys," he said, poking a stick into it. "Black as charcoal. Soil like this will grow anything." He hunted around the bank until he found a slash on a buttonwood tree that leaned across the creek to meet another on the opposite side. And after that, Pa seemed pretty certain where the fourth one was. He led them upstream, struggling through low bushes and sliding across muddy places, until finally they found the last marked tree. Pa looked around him with satisfaction. "It's a good parcel of land," he declared. "Flat for growing fields, with water nearby, but not swampy. We'll not have to worry about fever and ag. We can make a farm here." A farm. Here, in the midst of these giant trees, Daniel thought. Daniel tried to conjure up a picture of this farm in his mind, but it wouldn't come clear. You see, back in Pennsylvania, there were woods, all right, but also beautiful valleys with fields and open spaces, and neighbors just down the road. No neighbors would be just down the road here. There was no road. And no one living closer, Pa had said, than 15 miles. This state of Ohio was nothing but one huge, unending forest. "Pa," Daniel said slowly, "what about all the trees?" Pa looked at him, his eyes small in his broad, weathered face. He looked tired. His jaw, though, was firm, stubborn. That was what some folks back home called Pa. Just for a moment, in the dim green light, he reminded Daniel of one of those sturdy, tough-skinned trees standing all around them. What about all the trees? We'll chop them down, Pa said. And we'll stop right there at the end of chapter 1. Well, my friends, I hope you have enjoyed the first chapter of a very great book called Cabin on Trouble Creek that takes place in the year of 1803 when Thomas Jefferson was our president and Lewis and Clark were taking their journey across this great land of ours to explore what they could find. Have a great night. And I always like to end my read alouds with the same thing, wishing you a happy night and reminding you to brush your teeth and wash your hands and your face. Get into your clean pajamas and mind your parents. Get to bed, kid. All right, everybody. Good night. I got to find the stop record button. Let's see here. Found it.